The first time Charles Keller noticed the lantern burning in the old Tillman cabin, he stood at his kitchen window for a long while, coffee going cold in his hand, certain he was seeing something that did not belong to this world. He had not seen light in that cabin in 4 years. Not since old Dex Tillman had died of a rattlesnake bite in the summer of 1881, leaving the small 2-room structure to sit empty at the far southeastern edge of Charles's property line, where the scrub grass gave way to a stand of cottonwood trees and a slow-moving creek that barely deserved the name. Charles had bought the cabin and the quarter-acre it sat on from Dex's distant nephew, a banker in Denver who had no use for a tumble-down shack in the middle of the New Mexico territory. The price had been almost nothing. Charles had thought vaguely that he might use it for storage someday, or perhaps let a ranch hand stay there if he ever took on more help. He had done neither. The cabin sat at the edge of his life the way most things did, acknowledged and then set aside. Now, in the autumn of 1883, someone had put a light in its window. Charles set his coffee cup down on the pine table that dominated his kitchen and reached for his coat. It was early October, and the nights in New Mexico carried a sharp bite that the days did not prepare you for. He pulled on his boots, took his hat from the peg beside the door, and walked out into the dark. The walk across his property took about 20 minutes at a comfortable pace. Charles knew every inch of it, the place where the ground dipped near the old cistern, the cluster of mesquite that snagged at your shirt if you walked too close, the flat rock that sat in the middle of the path like a stubborn old man who had decided years ago that he was not moving. He walked past the barn where his 3 horses shifted and breathed in their stalls, past the smaller paddock where he kept the 2 mules he used for plowing, past the wide-open stretch of grass that in the spring would green up beautifully and in the summer would turn the color of a lion's coat. He approached the cabin from the front and saw, through the single window that faced north, the flickering orange of a fire in the small stone hearth. He also saw, stacked outside the door, a modest collection of luggage, a travel trunk, a pair of canvas bags, and a wooden crate with a lid nailed shut. He knocked on the door. There was a pause, and then the sound of movement inside. A bar scraped back from the door. He had not known the old door even had a bar, and then it swung open, and a woman stood in the frame with a long-barreled rifle leveled at his chest. Charles raised both hands. "I'm not here to cause trouble," he said. "My name is Charles Keller. I own this land." The woman studied him with dark eyes that caught the firelight from behind her. She was perhaps 28 or 29, with black hair that had come partly loose from a practical braid, and a face that was pretty in the way that things shaped by hard use sometimes become pretty defined and serious, and not asking for your opinion about it. She held the rifle steady, which told him she was not a stranger to it. "You own it," she said, "but you rented this cabin to me." Charles blinked. "I did not rent this cabin to anyone." "You most certainly did, through Mr. Harlan Briggs of the Briggs Land and Property Office in Santa Fe. I have the rental agreement in writing, signed by one C. Keller, dated the 14th of September. Charles stared at her. Then he said slowly, "Harlan Briggs." "Yes." "That man," Charles said with a controlled and quiet fury, "is going to have a very difficult conversation with me come Monday morning." The woman lowered the rifle slightly, not all the way, but enough to indicate she was thinking about it. "Are you saying the rental was not authorized?" "I am saying that Harlan Briggs has been trying to manage my properties for 3 years without my permission, and this is the first time he has actually managed to rent one. He has the original deed on file from the purchase. I suspect he helped himself to a copy of my signature from a separate document and applied it to this one." The woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Can you prove any of that?" "Not standing here in the dark, no." She considered this. Then she lowered the rifle fully and rested the butt of it on the floor beside the door. "My name is Opal Aldridge. I have paid 3 months' rent in advance. I have a signed agreement, and I have nowhere else to go tonight." She looked at him with an expression that was neither apologetic nor aggressive but simply honest. "What would you like to do about that?" Charles looked at her. He looked at the luggage stacked outside the door. He looked at the warm light coming from the cabin behind her, and thought about the cold walk back to his own house, and thought about what kind of man he wanted to be about this particular situation. "Are you in any danger?" he asked. She paused just long enough. "Not immediately." "That is not a no." "No," she agreed. "It is not." He nodded slowly. "Then stay for tonight. I will sort out the business with Briggs and we will settle the matter properly." He put his hat back on his head and turned to leave, then stopped. "The chimney on that fireplace draws to the left. Keep the fire small or you will fill the room with smoke." He heard her say quietly behind him, "Thank you." He walked back across his property in the dark and told himself it was simple human decency, and that it had nothing to do with the way the firelight had caught her eyes. Charles Keller was 34 years old and had lived alone on his 800 acres of New Mexico land since he was 26, when he had come out from Missouri with 2 horses, $100, and the particular kind of reckless optimism that young men carry into the West like a lantern they do not know will burn out. He had built the main house himself, added to it twice, established a small but reliable cattle operation, and grown into the kind of man that other men respected and women occasionally tried to fix. He had let them try, those women, the rancher's daughter in Albuquerque, the schoolteacher who had boarded at Marta Hennessy's place for one winter, the widow who had shown up at a church social with her eye clearly on something useful and stable. He had been polite and kind to all of them and had ultimately remained alone, because somewhere along the way he had stopped believing that his life had a space in it shaped like another person. He had made peace with that. He had a good horse named Colt, a reasonable dog named Porter who slept on the porch, and land that he understood and that, in its own way, understood him. He had made peace with a quiet and empty life. He had been quite sure of that, right up until a woman with a rifle had opened a door and looked at him like a problem she was prepared to handle. On Monday morning, he rode into Santa Fe and found Harlan Briggs at his office above the hardware store on San Francisco Street, a small and energetic man with the enthusiastic manner of someone who believed that confidence could substitute for permission. "Charles," Briggs said, extending his hand with a broad smile. "I was going to write to you this week." "You were going to write to me," Charles said, not shaking the hand, "after you forged my signature on a rental agreement." Briggs's smile adjusted itself but did not disappear. "Now, forged is a strong word. I have authority as your property manager. You are not my property manager. I have told you that on 4 separate occasions. As your informal advisor in property matters, I felt I was acting in your best interest. That cabin has been sitting empty for years, Charles. It is a liability, not an asset. The lady approached me looking for a quiet, private rental at a reasonable rate, and I simply made a decision that was not yours to make," Charles said. "Using my name," Briggs had the grace to look mildly uncomfortable. "The rental income goes directly to you. I took no commission." Charles looked at him for a long moment. "Who is she?" "Miss Aldridge. She is from Texas, originally. She has been living in Santa Fe for about 2 months. She worked as a schoolteacher in a town called Birch Creek, up near the Colorado border, but there was some trouble there. I don't know the particulars, and she needed to get away from it. She is quiet, well-mannered, and she paid 3 months in advance without complaint. She is not the sort to cause you grief. You seem to know a great deal about her for a man who claims he was acting in my interest." "I am a good listener," Briggs said unapologetically. Charles was quiet for a moment. He thought about the rifle. He thought about not immediately. "What kind of trouble in Birch Creek?" Briggs shifted in his chair. "The kind that follows a woman when she does not accept the attentions of a man with money and influence. A man by the name of Garrett Sloan. He owns most of the land and the only mill in that county. When she refused to, that is, she was engaged to his younger brother briefly, and when she broke it off, Sloan took it as a personal insult and made things difficult for her. She lost her teaching position, the school board he controlled. She has been moving since March." Charles absorbed this. He settled his hat more firmly on his head. "The rental agreement stands," he said finally, "'cause tearing it up would leave her without shelter, and that is not something I am willing to do. But you and I are going to have a formal and written agreement about exactly what authority you do and do not have regarding my properties. And if you ever put my name to a document without my explicit spoken permission, I will take the matter to the county sheriff. Are we understood?" Briggs nodded with the quick, grateful nod of a man who has just gotten away with something. Charles rode back to his ranch. He did not go to the cabin that day. He told himself there was no reason to disturb her. She was settled. She had paid. The matter was resolved. He went the next morning, because the night had turned cold enough to see his breath, and he wanted to make sure the chimney was drawing properly. Opal answered his knock without the rifle this time. She was wearing a dark green dress that had been mended at the sleeve, and her hair was braided and pinned, and she looked, in the morning light, more settled and less alarmed than she had 3 nights ago in the doorway. She had cleaned the cabin. He could smell the pine soap from the doorway and see that she had swept the floor and wiped down the single table and the 2 wooden chairs that had been left behind by old Dex Tillman. "Mr. Keller," she said. "Miss Aldridge. I wanted to check the chimney. It has a habit of pulling smoke back into the room in cold weather if the flue is not fully open." She stepped back and let him in. He checked the flue, which she had managed to open correctly, and he inspected the mortar around the base of the firebox where it had cracked slightly and would need pointing before winter fully set in. He told her he would send someone to do it or come himself. She thanked him. There was a book open on the table, a collection of essays, he noticed, by someone named Ralph Waldo Emerson, and a cup of tea steaming beside it. "How did you find Mr. Briggs?" he asked, because he was curious and did not see a reason to pretend otherwise. He had a notice in the Santa Fe paper: discreet accommodation, reasonable terms, private location. He was very kind. She paused. "He seemed to know exactly what I needed before I had finished explaining it." "That is either his gift or his habit," Charles said. "I have not decided which." The corner of her mouth moved. It was not quite a smile, but it was adjacent to one. "He told me the owner would likely never even know I was here." "Well," Charles said, "he was wrong about that." "He was wrong about several things," she agreed. She looked at him steadily. "Are you going to be a problem for me, Mr. Keller?" The question was so direct that it caught him off guard. He found himself respecting it even as it slightly disarmed him. "No," he said, "I am not that kind of man." She studied him with those dark eyes, measuring something he could not name. Then she nodded once, the way a person nods when they have decided to believe something on provisional terms. "Good." He left shortly after. Porter the dog followed him halfway back to the main house, and then turned around and trotted back toward the cabin, which Charles noted with an expression that was mostly wry and only a little betrayed. He began checking on the cabin every 2 or 3 days after that. He told himself it was because of the mortar issue, and then because he noticed the step on the front porch had a soft board that needed replacing, and then because October was turning toward November, and the water pipe that fed the small hand pump behind the cabin was prone to freezing at the joints. There was always something legitimate to address, and he addressed it. And while he was there, Opal Aldridge would sometimes offer him coffee and sometimes ask him practical questions about the land or the weather patterns. And they would talk for a while in the easy, cautious way of 2 people who are still learning the shape of each other. He learned that she had grown up in San Angelo, Texas, the daughter of a man who had run a small newspaper and a woman who had taught herself to read Latin out of sheer stubbornness. That she had become a teacher because she believed, fiercely and without apology, that education was the one thing that could not be taken from a person once it was given. That she had moved to Birch Creek 3 years ago with optimism and a trunk full of primers, and had built a school that she was genuinely proud of, and had watched it be dismantled by a man who could not accept the word no. "He had the school board remove me in April," she said one afternoon, sitting on the repaired porch step with her hands around a tin cup. Said my teaching was inappropriate, that I was giving the children ideas above their station. She said the last part with a precise and controlled bitterness. What he meant was that I had been teaching the Mexican children alongside the white children, and some of the parents complained, and he decided their complaint was more useful to him than my continuation. Charles looked out at the cottonwoods, which had gone yellow. That is a wrong thing, he said. It was simple, but he meant it without caveat. It is, she agreed. And it is also a common thing, and the fact that it is common does not make it less wrong, it just makes it more exhausting. He looked at her. Is that why you left, or was there more? She was quiet for a moment. He sent men to my boarding house. Not to hurt me, I think, just to frighten me. To stand outside and watch so that I would know I was watched. It worked eventually. I do not love that it worked, but I left because I did not see another outcome that kept me safe. You have a right to be safe, he said. She looked at him, and something in her expression shifted just slightly, just enough to be visible to someone paying attention, which he was. Thank you for saying that as though you mean it, she said. I do mean it. I know, she said. That is why I thanked you. Porter had adopted the habit of spending his nights at the cabin, and Charles had stopped pretending this was the dog's own decision made without encouragement. He brought firewood for her when he brought his own, and she had started leaving a small covered dish outside her door some evenings, bread, or a portion of whatever she had cooked, a way of saying thank you without making it complicated. He ate it at his own table and thought about the way she used words precisely, the way she did not fill silences with noise the way some people did, the way she had looked at him that first night with a rifle in her hands and complete composure in her face. November came in cold and gray and serious, and with it came a stranger. Charles saw the horse first, a bay with travel dust thick on its coat, tied to the post outside the general store in the small settlement of Crail, 3 miles from his ranch. He would not have thought anything of it except that when he came out of the store with his flour and lamp oil, the man sitting on the bench outside looked up at him and said, "You the Keller that owns the land by the cottonwoods?" The man was perhaps 40, well-dressed for a traveler, with the particular kind of stillness that Charles associated with men who were paid to do unpleasant things. He had a silver watch chain across his vest and a new hat that cost more than a working cowboy made in a month. "Who's asking?" Charles said. "My name is Aldous Webb. I represent certain business interests." "That is not an answer." "I represent Mr. Garrett Sloane," the man said. "I understand he may have some mutual acquaintance with a woman who has taken up residence near your property." Charles looked at him without expression for a long moment. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, and walked to his horse and rode home. He went directly to the cabin. Opal was hanging washing on the line she had strung between the 2 cottonwoods. She turned at the sound of his horse and read his face before he had said a word. "What happened?" she asked. He told her about Aldous Webb. He did not soften it or dress it up. She listened without interrupting, and when he finished she stood very still for a moment with a wet shirt still in her hands, and then she hung it with careful, deliberate precision, smoothing the collar flat. "He found me faster than I expected," she said. "He doesn't know you're here. He knows you're in the territory. He asked if I knew of mutual acquaintance near my land. I told him I did not know what he was talking about." She looked at him. "You lied for me." I gave an ambiguous answer. "That is a kind way to describe it." She was quiet for a moment. "What do you think he will do?" "Keep asking questions." "But Crail is small and people here tend to mind their own business, especially with strangers." "How did Sloane find out you were in New Mexico?" She exhaled. "Santa Fe. I stayed at a boarding house there for 6 weeks under my own name. I was tired and I thought enough time had passed. That was my mistake." "You should not have to hide your own name," Charles said with a heat that surprised him a little. "No," she agreed. "I should not." She turned to look at him fully, and there was something very steady and clear in her face. The face of a woman who had spent a long time standing in open ground and had decided that the only dignified response was to keep standing. "I'm not going to run again. I made that decision when I came here." Charles felt something settle in him, like a stone finding its place at the bottom of clear water. "Then you don't have to," he said. He rode to Crail the next morning and had a conversation with the sheriff, a thin, capable man named Roy Aldicoa who had been doing the job for 11 years, and who listened to Charles with the particular attention of a man who was good at separating the essential from the irrelevant. Charles explained the situation plainly: a woman renting a cabin on his property, a hired man from Texas asking questions on behalf of a man who had driven her out of her home and livelihood using his money and influence, and his own concern that this would escalate. "Sloan," Sheriff Aldicoa said, writing the name in his notebook. "I have heard that name. He has land interest in a couple of counties up north. Not a man people say no to easily." "She said no to him," Charles said. "That seems to be the issue." Aldicoa looked at him. "What is she to you, Charles?" Charles considered the question for longer than he intended to. "She is a tenant on my property," he said finally, "and a decent person who deserves to be let alone. I will write to the sheriff up in that county and see what I can find out. In the meantime, if this Webb fellow comes around again and causes a disturbance, you bring him to me." Charles thanked him and rode home. Over the weeks that followed, a careful and fragile peace settled over the land. Webb appeared twice more in Crail, asking questions at the saloon and the feed store, but got nothing useful from anyone because Charles had quietly mentioned to the half-dozen people he trusted in that small settlement that the man was not to be pointed in any particular direction. In a place that small, word moved like water, and within a day everyone who mattered knew to say nothing. It was the kind of collective, silent solidarity that frontier towns were capable of, the kind that arose not from heroism, but from the particular stubbornness of people who had all, at some point, needed to be left alone and knew what it cost when you weren't. In the meantime, without quite planning it, Charles and Opal had begun spending their evenings together. It had started with the mortar work. He had come to patch the fireplace on a Tuesday afternoon, and it had taken longer than expected, and she had made a pot of beans and cornbread, and it had seemed reasonable to eat before he walked back in the dark. They had sat at the small table in the cabin and talked for 3 hours, and he could not now have said afterward exactly what they had talked about Missouri and Texas, and what it had felt like to come west, and what they thought about the stars, which were extraordinary out here in a way that people who had not seen a New Mexico sky could not quite be prepared for. After that he came most evenings, or she walked the path to his house and sat on his porch, while he worked at the small table he kept on the covered part of the porch for mending tack and other hand work. She brought her books sometimes, or her sewing, and the silence between them was the comfortable kind, the kind you had to earn with another person before it became possible. He taught her to play poker with a worn deck of cards he kept in a kitchen drawer, though she proved to be so naturally good at keeping her expression neutral that he suspected she would have beaten him at it from the first hand if she had simply chosen to. She taught him with a patience that was both professional and personal, that he had been pronouncing Emerson's ideas correctly, but had been misunderstanding the one he liked best, which was the one about self-reliance. "You think it means that you do not need anyone," she said one evening, when the first real snow of the year was coming down outside, and they had the wood stove in his kitchen burning hot and bright. "But that is not what it means. It means that you should know your own worth." "That is a different thing entirely." Charles turned his coffee cup in his hands. "I am not sure I can see the difference." "If you truly could not see the difference," she said, "you would not have told me the truth about Harlan Briggs the night we met. You would not have spoken to the sheriff about Webb. You would not have spent the last 6 weeks bringing me firewood and fixing everything in that cabin that has needed fixing for 4 years. She looked at him with those steady eyes. "You are not a man who doesn't need anyone. You are a man who has gotten very good at pretending that he doesn't." Charles was quiet for a long time. Outside, the snow fell soft and continuous and the night was deeply still. "My wife died," he said, 8 years ago, before I came out here." Opal was quiet, waiting. "Her name was Clara. We had been married for 2 years. There was a fever that went through our county in the spring of 1875, and she got it, and she was gone in 9 days. I was 26 years old, and I could not stay in that house or in that town for another minute, so I came west and I built this." He looked around at the kitchen, the walls he had put up log by log, the window he had framed himself. "And I told myself that I had built a full life and I was content in it." "Were you?" Opal asked quietly. "Some of the time," he said honestly. "And the rest of the time I was just busy enough that I didn't notice the difference." He looked at her. "Until recently." The word landed between them in the warm, quiet kitchen, and Opal looked at him with an expression that was not surprise, because she had known this was coming and was not performance, because she was not a person who performed things, but was simply open and honest and careful in the way she was always careful with important things. "I am not an easy person," she said. "I have been told I am opinionated and too direct, and that I read too much and have too many thoughts about things that women are not supposed to have thoughts about. That sounds to me like a list of things I should feel fortunate to be in range of," Charles said. She laughed. It was the first time he had heard her laugh fully, not the near smile, not the quiet acknowledgement, but an actual laugh, warm and unguarded, and it filled the kitchen like the sound of a spring creek, and he felt something in his chest that had been still for a long time begin to move. "You are a surprising man, Charles Keller," she said. "You are a surprising woman, Opal Aldridge," he replied. They sat with that for a moment. The snow kept falling outside. Porter had come inside for once and was curled by the stove in a posture of complete satisfaction. "I should go back to the cabin," she said, but she did not move immediately. "The path will be slippery," he said. "The snow comes down faster than it looks. Are you offering me your couch? I am noting a meteorological fact." The near smile appeared. "Then I will take your note under advisement." But she did not go, and they talked until midnight, and when she finally pulled on her coat and walked home through the snow, he stood at the window and watched the lantern she carried until it reached the cabin and disappeared inside, and he stood there for some time after, his hand flat against the cold glass. December arrived with a boldness that impressed even the horses. The temperatures dropped hard, and the creek behind the cottonwoods froze at the edges, and the land took on that particular white stillness that made the world seem both smaller and more infinite at once. Charles brought the cattle into the lower pasture, and broke the ice in the water troughs each morning, and repaired a section of fence that had given way under the weight of the snow. Opal helped him one afternoon when he was working the fence line nearest the cabin, passing him wire, and holding the fence stretcher with steady competence while he drove staples, and they worked side by side in the cold without much need for words, which was by then a thing that they were very good at. It was on that afternoon, working in the pale winter sunlight with their breath making small clouds in the air, that he became certain, not just willing to wonder, but truly certain, that he was in love with her. It arrived not as a dramatic revelation, but as the simple recognition of something that had been true for some time, and that he had been carefully looking at sideways until this moment, when he looked at it directly and found it solid. He did not say anything yet. He was a careful man, and she had been through enough that he did not want to put any pressure on her, add any new thing to the weight she was already carrying. So he held it inside himself, and it was, he discovered, a pleasant thing to hold. The trouble with Garrett Sloane came to a head in the third week of December, when Aldous Webb rode directly onto Charles's property without invitation and knocked on the front door of the main house. Charles opened the door to find the man standing on his porch with an expression that had shifted from the neutral professional quality of their first meeting to something more direct and less polite. "I know she is here," Webb said. "I have been thorough, Mr. Keller." "You are trespassing on private property," Charles said. "Mr. Sloane is willing to be generous. He asks only that Miss Aldridge return to Birch Creek for a conversation. He believes there are misunderstandings that could be resolved." "Miss Aldridge is not here," Charles said. "And even if she were, she is a free woman in a free territory, and she does not owe anyone a conversation she does not wish to have." "Mr. Sloane does not. I do not care what Mr. Sloane does or does not, Charles said evenly. I care that you are on my land without my permission. You have 30 seconds to get back on your horse, and if you are not gone by the time I count to 30, I will ride directly to Sheriff Aldicoa's office and file a trespassing complaint. Given that the sheriff has already written to the authorities in your county and has a fairly comprehensive picture of Mr. Sloane's history of harassment, I think that conversation would be interesting for all involved. Webb studied him for a moment. Then he turned and walked back to his horse and rode away without another word. Charles went to the cabin. Opal was at the table with a letter she had been writing, a thing she did most days, letters to former students. She had told him, because she wanted them to know that a teacher remembering them was a form of teaching that did not require a schoolhouse. She looked up when he came in, and he told her about Webb, and she put her pen down. He will not go quietly, she said. Sloane is the kind of man who decides that a thing he cannot have is a thing that must be destroyed. He does not have anything to destroy here, Charles said. You have broken no law. You have not even spoken to him or his representative. You are a woman renting a legal cabin on private land. There is nothing he can compel. He could make your life difficult, she said, and she looked at him with something that was both gratitude and guilt. On my account. Let him try, Charles. Opal, he said, and then he stopped, because her name in his mouth was still a thing he had to be slightly careful with, the way you are careful with something that matters. I have 800 acres and an 11-year relationship with the county sheriff, and nothing that Garrett Sloane can take from me by sending a man in a new hat to knock on my door. You are not a burden. You are not a complication. He paused, then decided to be honest because that was the only way he knew to be. You are the most important thing on this land, and I am not going to let anyone make you feel otherwise. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up from the table and crossed the small room and took hold of his hand with both of hers, and they stood like that for a moment, and it was somehow more intimate than anything he had imagined, this simple holding of hands in a small, warm room in the middle of winter. You are a remarkable man, she said quietly, and I need you to know that this, whatever this is between us, is not something I take lightly. I have spent a long time being very careful about who I trust, and I am trusting you, and that is not small. I know, he said. It is not small to me either. She looked up at him, and he looked down at her, and the space between their faces was about 6 inches, and then it was less than that. And then she kissed him, or he kissed her, and afterward neither of them could have said with certainty who had started it. It was gentle and brief and completely decisive, the way the first sentence of an important story is both small and total. When they stepped back, she was looking at him with those steady eyes and a warmth in her face that he had not seen before, a softness that coexisted easily with the precision and the directness and the rifle by the door. I should finish my letter, she said. You should, he agreed. You could stay, she offered. If you like. He stayed. Sheriff Aldicoa rode out 2 days later with a document from the county authorities in Colorado, which established, in formal and legal language, that Garrett Sloane had a history of harassment complaints filed against him by at least 4 other individuals in 2 counties, and that Aldous Webb, as his agent, was now under legal advisement to cease contact with Opal Aldridge or face charges. Sloane himself had apparently, upon learning that the New Mexico Territory Sheriff was in communication with Colorado authorities and was a thorough and tenacious man, quietly recalled Webb and distanced himself from the matter. Aldicoa handed Charles the document on his porch and said, with the understated satisfaction of a good official who rarely got to deliver unambiguous good news, I believe the lady can consider herself clear. Charles brought the document to Opal that same afternoon. She read it twice, slowly and carefully, in the way she read everything. Then she set it on the table and sat very still for a moment. It is over, she said, and her voice was measured but her hands were not quite steady. It is over, he confirmed. She pressed both hands flat on the table, a grounding gesture, and took a breath. Then she looked at him with an expression that was complex and unguarded relief and grief and something else, something warm and a little frightened, the look of a person who has been braced against a storm for so long that the sudden cessation of wind is almost disorienting. "I do not know what to do now," she admitted. "I have been moving and watching and worrying for the better part of a year, and now she stopped. "I do not know what I look like without all of that." "You look like yourself," he said. "You look like the woman who sat on that porch step in October and told me that it was not a no." She laughed, and it broke through her voice a little, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth for just a moment, and then she straightened and looked at him with clear eyes. "I want to stay," she said. "Not because I have nowhere to go. I have options now. She shook her head. "I want to stay here because of you." Charles's heart did something complicated and complete. "I want you to stay," he said, "very much." "I should tell you something," she said. "I am not going to be a quiet, domestic kind of woman who stays inside and keeps to herself. I am going to have opinions about things, and I am going to express them, and I may want to start a school in Crail eventually because the children in this county deserve one, and I am going to teach whoever comes through the door regardless of what they look like or where they come from." "I know," he said. "You know. Opal," he said with a patience that was also affection, "I have known you for 2 months. I know exactly who you are. I am counting on it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she stood up and walked to him, and he opened his arms and she leaned into him, and they stayed like that in the small, warm cabin for a long time, the winter outside doing what winter does, unconcerned. Christmas came to the New Mexico territory in 1883 with a gentleness that felt like a gift. The snow lay quiet on the land, and the sky was the deep, cold blue of something that has no patience for pretense. And Charles strung pine boughs along his porch railing for no particular reason, except that he found himself wanting the house to look like it had something to celebrate, which it did. He had written to his sister in Missouri, the only family he had kept close, a practical and perceptive woman named Ruth who had been after him for years to stop being so solitary, and told her about Opal. The letter he had written had been 3 drafts before he found the right words, and even then the right words had turned out to be fairly simple ones. "There is a woman here, and I believe I love her, and I think you would like her very much." Ruth's reply had come back with characteristic speed and efficiency. "Then, for heaven's sake, Charles, do something about it." He had been planning to do something about it, but the something required care, because Opal was a woman of substantial self-possession, and would not take kindly to grand gestures made for their own sake, and he wanted whatever he said to her to be genuine and not theatrical. He chose Christmas Eve, because it seemed like the right kind of evening, her cabin warm and lit, the land outside covered in clean white snow, the particular intimacy of a night that people had spent for centuries trying to make beautiful. He walked over with a package under his arm, a book he had ordered specially from a bookseller in Santa Fe, a collection of writings on philosophy and natural science that he had found listed in a catalog, and thought she would find genuinely interesting. Not a romantic gift precisely, but a gift that said, "I know who you are and I respect it," and knocked on the cabin door. She opened it wearing a dark blue dress she had not worn before, and her hair was down rather than braided, and it fell in dark waves to her shoulders, and he stood for a moment on the porch just looking at her, which he was rarely unguarded enough to do so openly. "Merry Christmas," she said, with a smile that was not the near smile but the full, warm one that he had been collecting carefully in his memory, the way a man in the desert thinks about water. "Merry Christmas," he said, and came inside. They ate a dinner she had made from a recipe she told him her mother had used every Christmas Eve. A simple stew with dried herbs from the small bundle of plants she had hung to dry in September, and biscuits, and apple preserves that had come from a jar she had traded for in Crail. It was the best meal he had eaten in years, and he told her so without qualification, and she laughed and said he was easy to impress, and he said that was not true, but she was genuinely talented. After dinner, they sat by the fire with coffee, and she opened his gift and was genuinely delighted in the way he had hoped, running her thumb along the spine and reading the chapter headings, and then setting the book aside very carefully in the way that people set aside things they plan to return to seriously. "I have something for you too," she said, and went to the wooden crate in the corner that she had never fully unpacked. She lifted the lid and reached inside and brought out a small watercolor painting, perhaps 8 inches by 10, in a simple frame. It was a painting of a landscape rolling grass, the particular blue of a western sky, a single tree in the middle distance with its branches stretching wide. "I painted it in October," she said, "when the light on your land was doing something remarkable in the mornings. I was going to give it to you sooner, but it did not seem—" She stopped. "It seemed like too much before." He took it from her carefully and looked at it for a long time. She was good. The painting had the light exactly right, that particular golden October light that he had been watching his whole life and never had words for, and she had found it in paint. His land, seen through her eyes. He felt the weight of that deeply. "It is beautiful," he said, and he was not talking only about the painting. She looked at him and he looked at her, and he set the painting down carefully on the table and said, "Opal." "Yes," she said, which was not precisely an answer to anything he had said, but was perhaps an answer to what he was about to say. "I am not a man who finds it easy to say what he means when it matters most," he said. "But I need to say this clearly so there is no ambiguity. I love you. I have loved you for some time, probably since you stood in this doorway with a rifle and told me with complete composure that you had nowhere else to go tonight. I know that is perhaps not the most conventional origin for a feeling of this kind, but there it is." Opal looked at him with her whole face open, which was a thing she did rarely, and only with things she trusted entirely. Her eyes were very bright in the firelight. "I love you too," she said, "since probably about the time you said I do not care what Mr. Sloane does or does not, which is also perhaps not conventional." "We are perhaps not conventional people," he said. "No," she agreed. "We are not." He took her hands in both of his, the way she had taken his hand weeks before, and then he said, "I would like to marry you if you will have me. Not because it is practical, though it is. Not because the territory makes it complicated for an unmarried woman living on a man's property, though it does. But because you are the person I want to spend my life with, and I want to say that in front of God and whatever witnesses we can find in Crail, which will not be many, but they will be sincere." Opal laughed, and it was the best sound he had ever heard in this or any other room. "Charles Keller," she said, "that may be the most carefully hedged marriage proposal in the history of the New Mexico Territory. Is that a yes?" "It is absolutely a yes," she said, and she put her hands on either side of his face and kissed him with the warmth and certainty of a woman who had decided something important and had no doubt about it at all. They were married in February of 1884, in the small church in Crail that was not much more than 4 walls and a cross, with Reverend Thomas Macy officiating and Roy Aldecoa and his wife Maria as witnesses, and Harlan Briggs in attendance looking deeply pleased with himself, which Charles had decided to let him have because, without Briggs's unauthorized intervention, none of this would have happened, a fact that was simultaneously infuriating and irrefutable. Ruth had written to say she could not come from Missouri in February, but that she expected to visit in spring and would be bringing a gift of the practical kind. Opal wore a dress she had made herself in the weeks before the wedding, ivory-colored and simple, and made with the same precise care she brought to everything, and she walked up the aisle of the small church on her own, because there was no one to give her away, and she pointed out that she was not something that needed to be given, and Reverend Macy had the good sense to agree. When Charles took her hands at the altar, he thought about all the ways he had been certain his life was already complete and closed, all the careful peace he had made with emptiness, and he thought about a lantern burning in a window he had not expected, and he thought about the particular mercy of being wrong about the things you were most sure of. "I will," he said, when the moment came, with a simplicity that held everything. "I will," said Opal, looking at him with those clear, steady eyes and meaning it with every part of herself. Spring came to the property, the way spring came to New Mexico. Not gradually, but in a sudden, brilliant event, as though the land had been holding its breath and finally released it all at once. The grass came green and fast, and the cottonwoods along the creek put out their first small leaves, and the horses were skittish with the change in air, and the sky became an outrageous, improbable blue that made Charles stop what he was doing sometimes and just look at it for a moment, because it seemed wrong not to. Opal had moved into the main house the day after the wedding, and the cabin had been closed up again, though not in the abandoned way it had been before. It was closed now the way you close a room that you might use again, with the sense that it had served its purpose beautifully and might yet have another purpose in time. She had, as she had promised, already begun talking to people in Crail about a school. She had spoken to 3 families with children of school age, and to the minister, and to a woman named Dorothy Vargas who had 6 children, and had told Opal with a directness matching her own that she would send every single one of them if someone built a schoolroom that was not going to insult them by the door. "She means that her children are half Mexican and she does not want them turned away," Opal told Charles one evening. "That seems reasonable," Charles said. "It is completely reasonable. I told her that any child who came through the door of my school would be taught without distinction. She looked at me for a long time, and then she offered to help build the schoolroom herself. Can she? She said her father was a carpenter and she learned from him. I believe her completely." Charles smiled. "We can use some of the cedar from the south lot," he said. "There is more than I need for the fence repairs. And Tom Aldecoa, Roy's youngest son, he has been looking for work. He is good with a hammer." She looked at him. "You would do that? Build a school in my county for children who deserve one?" He raised an eyebrow. "I would be ashamed not to." She came around the table and put her arms around him from behind, pressing her cheek against the back of his shoulder, and he felt the warmth of her against him like something he had always been missing and had not known until he had found it that there had been a missing. "I love you," she said into his shoulder. "I love you," he said, with the ease of a man who had found the words and intended to use them often. Ruth arrived in April, as promised, with a trunk full of practical gifts that included preserving jars, seed packets for a kitchen garden, and a crate of good Missouri apple tree saplings because, she said in the accompanying note, a property without a proper apple tree was a property that had not yet reached its potential. She was a tall woman, Charles's sister, with his same dark coloring and none of his patience for keeping things to herself, and she took one look at Opal and said, "Well, thank God." "I was beginning to think my brother was going to spend the rest of his life being industrious and alone." "He is still very industrious," Opal said. "But no longer alone, which was the point," Ruth replied, and embraced her with the confident warmth of a woman who had decided on the spot that this was someone worth keeping. Ruth stayed for 3 weeks. She and Opal argued companionably about literature and agreed enthusiastically about most things of substance, and she helped plant the kitchen garden and gave Charles detailed and unsolicited opinions about his fence construction that were, he admitted privately, mostly correct. When she left, she held Opal's hands for a long moment and said, "You are exactly what he needed, and I hope you know that you are also, now, stuck with a family that is small but very determined." Opal laughed. "I find I do not mind at all," she said. The school in Crail was finished by June. It was a single room with 4 windows, a proper board floor, and a long workbench along one wall for writing. Dorothy Vargas had been as good as her word. She had planned the roof framing herself, and it was solid and straight and built to last through a New Mexico winter without complaint. Tom Aldecoa had done the floor and the window frames, and Charles had done the foundation and much of the wall construction. And by the time it was done, half of Crail had contributed something to it, because that is what small places do with things they have decided to be proud of. Opal stood in the doorway on the morning it was completed and looked at the empty room with the summer light coming through the 4 windows and making long, bright rectangles on the new floor, and she was very quiet for a moment. "When I left Birch Creek," she said, "I thought I had lost this. I thought I was done with teaching, that the only school I would ever build had been taken from me." She turned and looked at Charles, who was standing in the yard with sawdust still on his shirt and his hat pushed back on his head. "I did not think I would build another one." "You have been building one since October," he said. "You just did not know it yet." She came down the steps and kissed him in the yard in front of Dorothy Vargas and Tom Aldecoa, and 2 of Dorothy's older children, who made the kinds of noises that children make when adults do affectionate things in public, and neither Charles nor Opal paid them any attention whatsoever. The school opened in September of 1884, with 11 students ranging in age from 5 to 14, from 4 different families, and Opal taught them all with the fierce and patient joy of a woman doing the exact thing she was put on the earth to do. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography, and on Fridays, a broader lesson she called Nature and the World, which involved going outside and looking carefully at things. She had no distinction of the children by family or origin or any other category, and when one parent, a stubborn and small-minded man named Irwin Cole, who owned a modest supply store, came to tell her that he did not think his boy should be sitting next to the Vargas children, she looked at him with a patience that was clearly costing her something and said, "Mr. Cole, your boy is going to share this world with every manner of person in it. Learning to sit beside someone and learn something together is the most useful preparation for that I can offer him. If you would like to discuss it further, I am happy to do so on Friday afternoons after school. Otherwise, I trust you will let him get on with his education." Cole had looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man who had expected to win this conversation and had not, and then he had left, and his boy had come back to school the next day, and had subsequently developed a genuine friendship with Dorothy Vargas's second son, which Charles thought was probably the best possible outcome for everyone concerned. In the autumn of 1884, Opal told Charles she was pregnant. She told him on the porch of the main house in the late afternoon, with the light going gold across the grass and the horses standing quiet in the paddock, and he received the news with a stillness that briefly concerned her until she saw his face, which was not still at all but was, in fact, the face of a man who has just been handed something extraordinary and is taking a moment to understand the size of it. He stood up from his chair and went to her and held her with both arms for a long time without saying anything, and then he said into her hair, "Are you well? Are you frightened?" "I am well," she said, "and a little frightened. Are you?" "More frightened than I have been of anything in a very long time," he said, "and happier than I thought it was possible to be in a single moment." "That is a reasonable response," she said. "I thought so," he agreed. He did not let her carry the heavy wash bucket through winter. She told him this was unnecessary. He continued to do it anyway, with such cheerful stubbornness that she eventually stopped arguing and simply watched him with an expression of fond exasperation. He read everything the local doctor in Crail, a competent and sensible man named Dr. Harlan Pierce, could recommend on the subject of pregnancy and childbirth. Dr. Pierce had looked at him over his glasses when Charles had come to his office and asked for guidance and said, with a slight smile, "Most men just go about their business and trust the women to manage. You are not most men." "No," Charles agreed. "I am not." He carried his worry quietly and he carried his hope loudly, and Opal let him do both because she understood that this was how he loved, with his hands and his preparation, and his stubborn refusal to let anything go wrong without at least trying to prevent it first. Their son was born in June of 1885, on a warm Tuesday morning when the land outside was green and the cottonwoods were full, and the creek was running high from the spring melt. Dr. Pierce was there, and Dorothy Vargas came to help, because she had 6 children and knew the business of it better than almost anyone. And Charles paced his porch for 3 hours and wore a groove in the boards that he would notice every time he walked over that spot for the rest of his life. When Dorothy came to the door and told him it was done and they were both well, he went inside and stood beside the bed where Opal lay with the baby against her chest, a red-faced, dark-haired, thoroughly opinionated small person who was already making his feelings about his new existence audible, and he could not for a moment say anything at all. Opal looked up at him with tired, luminous eyes. "Hello," she said. "Hello," he managed. "He looks like you," she said. "He is considerably louder than me," Charles said. She laughed, exhausted and happy. "His name," she said, looking down at the baby, "I thought if you agreed, I thought we might call him James, after my father." "James Keller," Charles said, and the sound of it in the air made the world feel newly solid and true. "Yes, absolutely." He sat on the edge of the bed and put his hand very carefully against the baby's small head, and James Keller opened his eyes for just a moment and looked up at him with the unfocused and ancient-seeming gaze of the newly arrived, and Charles felt his whole heart rearrange itself into something he had not known it was capable of becoming. "Thank you," he said to Opal. It meant many things. "Thank you," she said back. It meant the same many things differently ordered. The years that followed were full in the way that good years are, not without difficulty, because nothing without difficulty is real, but full in the sense that every part of them was inhabited and alive and mattered. The school in Crail grew. By 1887, there were 17 students, and Opal had arranged with the county for a small teaching salary that, while modest, was proof that the school was recognized as legitimate. She hired a part-time assistant, a young woman named Flora Jimenez who had grown up bilingual and could teach the Spanish-speaking children in their own language while they learned English, which Opal considered not a luxury but an obvious necessity. She wrote letters to the Territorial Education Office until they responded, and then she wrote more letters until they sent someone to visit, and when the visiting official, a self-important man from Santa Fe named Gerald Farrow, appeared to be prepared to dismiss the school based on the diversity of its student body. She sat him down in the empty classroom after hours and gave him a 45-minute lecture on the educational research of Horace Mann and the philosophical basis for universal public education that left him so thoroughly outmaneuvered that he approved the school's continued funding largely out of exhaustion. Charles had heard the whole thing through the open window, where he had been waiting with the wagon, and he had thought, not for the first time, that the luckiest thing he had ever done in his life was to walk across his own property in the dark toward an unexpected light. Their daughter, Clara, was born in 1887. Charles had chosen the name, offered it quietly one evening with the knowledge that it came with history, and Opal had taken his hand and said yes without hesitation, because she understood what it meant to honor someone you had loved and lost, and she did not believe that the past and the present needed to be at war with each other. Clara arrived in October, with the cottonwoods going yellow outside and the same clear light that had made Opal want to paint the land that first autumn. She was quieter than James had been at birth, and more watchful, and looked at the world from her first days with an expression of serious consideration that made Charles laugh with recognition, because it was entirely her mother's expression, reduced to the size of an infant and somehow even more formidable for that. James, who was 2 and had strong opinions about his importance in the household, inspected his sister with a proprietary air and declared her acceptable. Opal and Charles exchanged a look over his head that contained several volumes of amusement. The ranch had grown too. Charles had expanded his cattle operation carefully, never faster than he could manage well, adding acreage when it became available, and building a second barn in the summer of 1886. He had taken on 2 full-time ranch hands, a quiet, competent young man from Arizona named Will Santos and an older cowboy named Pete McCready, who had been working the New Mexico range for 20 years, and who knew the land and the weather and the cattle with an intimacy that Charles respected and learned from. Pete lived in the bunkhouse and ate most of his meals at the main house, and he and Opal had developed a friendship based on a shared love of strong coffee and strong opinions, which Charles found both endearing and mildly bewildering. The old Tillman cabin at the edge of the property was used now for storage through the winter, and as a bunkhouse for Will Santos through the warmer months, which Will seemed to prefer to the main bunkhouse because it was quieter. Pete had pronounced this antisocial, and Will had said that was the point, and Pete had been genuinely charmed by this answer. Harlan Briggs had been allowed to formally manage the rental and sale of one small plot of Charles's eastern property in 1886, under a written and explicit and extensively negotiated agreement, and had done it correctly and efficiently, and had taken his commission without drama. He had sent a gift when James was born, a very good blanket and a note that said, with his characteristic and infuriating irrepressibility, "I still think I deserve some credit." Charles had shown the note to Opal, who had laughed so hard she had to sit down. In the spring of 1888, Charles sat on his porch in the evening light with Opal beside him and James on the porch steps catching beetles in a tin, Ken with the focused intensity of a 6-year-old with a mission, and Clara in the small wooden rocker that Charles had built for Opal before Clara was born, and Porter, old now, with a gray muzzle but still deeply convinced that the porch was his domain, stretched across the top step in the full last light of the sun. The land was the same land it had always been. The grass ran green toward the cottonwoods and the mountains were blue in the distance, and the sky had gone the color of peaches and copper in the west where the sun was lowering itself behind the ridge. The air smelled of the kitchen garden Opal had planted with Ruth's seeds 4 years ago, and of horses, and of the cedar logs stacked under the eave for next winter's fires. "What are you thinking?" Opal asked. She had a book in her lap, but she was not reading it. She was looking at the land the way she always looked at it, with the attention of a painter, cataloging the light. "I was thinking about the night I walked across this land in the dark," he said, "and saw a light in the cabin." She looked at him. "And what did you think?" "I thought I was seeing something that did not belong," he said, "and I was entirely wrong. It was the only thing that was supposed to be there." He paused. "I had made peace with my life being a certain way, quiet, sufficient. I thought I had everything I needed. And," she said with the near smile which had become over the years as familiar to him as his own reflection, "and I did not know what I was missing until I was standing in that doorway looking at you with a rifle, and then I knew, though I did not admit it to myself for some time." She leaned her head against his shoulder. They sat like that, watching the light change on the land that was theirs and would be their children's, and that held, now, every significant thing that had happened to him. James announced from the steps that he had caught 4 beetles and intended to catch at least 6 before dinner, and Charles said that was an ambitious goal and he respected it, and Opal said that the beetles were to be released before they came inside, and James said he knew that, Mom, with the aggrieved tone of a child who definitely had not known that until just now. Clara reached out from her rocker and grabbed Charles's finger with her small fist, the way she had done since she was very small, as if wanting to make sure he was still there. He wrapped his hand gently around hers. The sun finished its lowering. The stars began to appear, one by one, in the deep blue east, the way they always did out here, not all at once but gradually, like an audience settling in for something they intended to watch carefully. Opal looked up at them with her head still resting on his shoulder, and he looked at her looking at the stars, and he thought about all the quiet and empty evenings he had sat on this porch alone, and been so certain that the quiet was enough, and he thought about how strange and complete and thoroughly right it was that it had taken a lantern in a window to show him the difference between a life that was sufficient and a life that was full. He turned his head and pressed his lips to the top of her hair, and she made a small, contented sound and turned the page of her book without looking at it, because she was not reading it. She was simply here with him on their porch in their evening on their land. "I love you," he said quietly into her hair. "I love you," she said, against his shoulder, with the ease of a woman who has said it 1,000 times and intends to say it 1,000 more. James called from the steps that he had gotten 6 beetles and was now going for 8, because why settle for the original goal when the original goal had already been achieved? "He gets that from you," Opal said. "He absolutely does not," Charles said. She tilted her head back and looked at him with a laugh in her eyes, and he looked back at her, and the evening settled around them like something that knew where it belonged, and the land was good, and the air was warm, and every light in every window of the house that he had built with his own hands and filled, at last, with everything that mattered, was burning steady and bright against the coming dark. Pete McCready came around from the bunkhouse to announce that supper was nearly ready. He had developed the habit of helping in the kitchen on Tuesdays, though he insisted it was only because he did not trust Charles near a stove, which Charles conceded was fair. And James abandoned his beetle project and thundered up the steps, and Clara was handed carefully to Charles while Opal got up to go inside. And Charles sat for one more moment with his daughter in his arms, and his son brushing past him through the door, and the sound of Opal's voice inside already talking to Pete about whether the beans had enough salt. A conversation they would have every Tuesday and never resolve, and he thought about peace. He had made peace with a quiet and empty life. He had been so sure of that peace, so settled in it, so convinced that what he had was what he would always have. He had not known, could not have known, standing alone at his kitchen window in the dark, that the light in the old cabin was not a disruption but an arrival. Not something that did not belong, but something that had been on its way to him for years, finding its path across a dark country, burning steady, waiting to be seen. He had been wrong about the empty life. He had been wrong in the most complete and irreversible and wonderful way that a person can be wrong, and he was grateful for it every single day. And he intended to go on being grateful for it for every day that remained to him, which he hoped, with all of himself, would be very many. He stood up with Clara in his arms, pushed the door open with his shoulder, and went inside to his family.